The emergency signal came through every communication channel in the galaxy at the same time, and Ambassador Veltari of the Ashanti Republic stood before the massive transmission array with her 4 arms shaking as she prepared to send what might be the last message her people would ever broadcast to the stars. The Void Swarm had taken 12 systems in the past month, and their dark ships moved like a plague across space, consuming everything in their path and leaving only empty worlds behind. Them and the Galactic Harmony Coalition, with all its advanced technology and peaceful ideals, was losing badly against an enemy that did not negotiate or show mercy. Veltari looked at her aide, who nodded grimly as the transmission began to reach every corner of known space, including the small yellow star system called Sol, where a species called humans lived on a dangerous world they somehow called home. The message was simple and desperate and carried the weight of billions of lives hanging in the balance as she spoke into the void, hoping someone somewhere would answer their call for help before it was too late for all of them. Far away from the dying coalition worlds, Admiral Lee Dongwu sat in his command chair aboard Luna Station, watching the alien transmission with interest as the strange creature with 4 arms and blue skin begged for military assistance against something called the Void. Swarm Lee had gray hair and serious eyes that had seen many battles during Earth's unification wars, and he understood desperation when he heard it, even from an alien species that had ignored humanity for decades while they built their perfect, peaceful society. Captain Park Ji-min stood beside him reading the tactical data that came with the message, and her young face showed the same grim expression that all military officers learned when studying an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. The Void Swarm, according to the Coalition data, was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before, and their ships were organic constructs that could rebuild themselves, and their numbers seemed endless as they spread from system to system like a disease. Dr. Kim Tae-ho had been studying alien cultures since first contact, and he translated the parts of the message that the computer systems missed, and his report made it clear that the Coalition was not exaggerating the threat they faced. The aliens had superior technology in many ways, but they had built their entire civilization around avoiding conflict, and now they faced an enemy that lived only for war and destruction, and their peaceful fleets were being destroyed faster than they could build new ones. Lee looked at the data again and made calculations in his head about what it would take to reach Coalition space, and what kind of force humanity could send if they decided to get involved in this galactic war. Earth had spent the last 50 years building warships in secret, while the galaxy thought humans were still primitive and violent but not worth worrying about, and now those ships sat in hidden bases throughout the solar system, ready for the war that everyone hoped would never come. The Coalition expected primitive vessels, if they expected anything at all, from the Deathworld species that barely had faster than light travel according to their outdated information, and they certainly did not expect humanity to have the largest military fleet in their part of the galaxy. Park Ji-min pulled up the fleet status reports and showed Lee the numbers that made other nations tremble when they learned the truth about human military preparation, and she waited for his decision while the alien message continued to play on screens throughout the station. 2,347 ships of various classes sat ready for deployment, and every one of them had been built for war against enemies that might be stronger or more advanced than humanity, and every crew had trained for years in combat scenarios that most species would consider impossible to survive. The human ships looked crude compared to alien vessels with their elegant curves and beautiful designs, but they had been built by engineers who understood that space was trying to kill everything in it, and that sometimes the only way to win a battle was to be willing to take damage that would destroy a prettier ship. Lee stood up and walked to the communication station where Lieutenant Yu Sang-wook waited for orders, and the young officer had already prepared the response systems that would send humanity's answer back to Coalition space. The Admiral looked out at the stars through the station windows and thought about the choice he was making for his entire species, because once they left Earth's protection, they would be part of galactic politics whether they wanted to be or not. Humanity had always been good at war because Earth had taught them to be good at it, and every day on their homeworld was a struggle against a planet that seemed designed to kill anything that lived on it, and this made humans different from the peaceful aliens who had never faced real danger. The Coalition data showed that they expected maybe 50 human ships, if They were lucky, and they planned to use those ships as cannon fodder, while their own fleet stayed safe and tried to find a diplomatic solution to a problem that could not be solved with words. Lee made his decision and gave the orders that would change everything, and you sent the message that would shock the galaxy when the Coalition realized what was coming to help them in their darkest hour. The message was short and simple, and said that humanity would answer the Coalition call for aid, and that Earth's fleet would arrive at the designated coordinates within 30 days, and that they should prepare for the kind of war that their peaceful civilization had never imagined. Park Jimin began issuing fleet orders, and every ship in the solar system started preparing for departure, while their crews loaded weapons and supplies for a campaign that might last years if the Void Swarm was as dangerous as the aliens claimed. Dr. Kim started studying everything the Coalition had sent about alien psychology and culture, because humans would need to work with species they had never met before, and some of those species might not understand human methods of warfare. The fleet began moving toward the jump points that would take them to Coalition space, and their black hulls reflected no light as they formed up in attack formations that had been practiced 1,000 times in simulation, but never used in real combat against an alien enemy. Lee watched his ships prepare for departure, and knew that when they arrived at the battle zone, the aliens would get exactly what they asked for, but not what they expected. Because humanity had learned long ago that sometimes being the hero meant being the monster that other monsters feared. Transmission ended, and Luna Station fell quiet as the last ships disappeared into hyperspace, carrying the hopes of two civilizations toward a war that would decide the fate of the galaxy and change how every species thought about the humans from the dangerous world they called Earth. The Coalition fleet waited at Kepler Station with desperate hope as their sensors showed the approaching hyperspace signatures that meant the human reinforcements were finally arriving, and Ambassador Veltari stood on the bridge of the command ship expecting to see a small group of primitive vessels emerge from the Jump Points fleet. Admiral Kang Jun-ho watched the countdown timer on his flagship and gave the order for the entire human fleet to exit hyperspace at exactly the same moment, in a display of coordination that would announce their arrival to every ship in the system. The first thing that emerged was the massive dreadnought Indomitable Spirit, and its black hull stretched for over 2 kilometers, while its weapon ports glowed with the energy signatures that marked it as a ship built for one purpose, which was destroying other ships in combat. Behind the flagship came wave after wave of human vessels and cruisers and destroyers and carriers and support ships, all painted in the same non-reflective black that made them look like holes torn in space itself. Commander Choi Hye-jin stood at her tactical station aboard the flagship and watched the alien reactions as their sensors tried to count the human ships and kept getting higher numbers than anyone had expected from a species they considered barely space-capable. The Coalition officers stared at their displays in shock as the human fleet continued to arrive, and the final count showed over 2,000 vessels of various classes arranged in perfect formation, as if they had been practicing this maneuver for years. Lieutenant Yu Sang-wook opened communications with the alien command ship, and his voice was calm and professional as he announced that the Earth Defense Force had arrived and was ready to begin operations against the Void Swarm immediately. Ambassador Veltari tried to hide her amazement as she responded to the human transmission, but her 4 arms shook as she realized that these primitive Deathworlders had brought a fleet larger than anything the Coalition had seen in their entire history. The human ships moved with precision that spoke of crews who had trained together for years, and their formations shifted and adapted as they took positions around the Coalition vessels like guards protecting something valuable. General Ryu Mi-young commanded the troop transports that carried human soldiers in powered armor that looked more like walking tanks than anything the Coalition used for ground operations, and her Marines were eager to test their equipment against the Void Swarm forces. Captain Park Jimin led her fighter squadron through a complex patrol pattern around the fleet, and her pilots flew their ships through maneuvers that made the alien observers nervous because humans seemed to ignore safety margins that other species considered absolute minimums. The alien ships were beautiful, with smooth curves and elegant designs that showed their builders believed in form as much as function. But the human vessels looked like they had been designed by engineers who expected to fight in conditions that would destroy prettier ships. Kang studied the Coalition fleet through his view screen and noted that their ships had minimal armor and relied on shields for protection, while human ships had both shields and armor plating, thick enough to survive direct hits from weapons that would cripple alien vessels. The communication channels filled with chatter as Coalition officers tried to understand what they were seeing, and their databases had no information about human military capabilities beyond basic, faster-than-light travel and primitive nuclear weapons. Choi ran tactical assessments on the alien ships and found that they were built for precision combat between civilized opponents who followed rules of engagement and codes of honor that meant nothing to an enemy like the Void Swarm. The human fleet began deploying in defensive positions around Kepler Station, and their ships moved to locations that gave them overlapping fields of fire and multiple escape routes, because human doctrine assumed that every battle might require fighting, while retreating Park's fighters performed reconnaissance sweeps of the surrounding space, and her pilots reported back using communication protocols that confused the alien listeners, because humans used military code words that had no direct translations. The Coalition commanders requested a meeting to coordinate their forces, and Kang agreed, but he brought his senior officers to the alien flagship where they could study Coalition technology and tactics firsthand. The alien command center was filled with holographic displays and peaceful music that was supposed to keep the crew calm during stressful situations, but the humans found it distracting and asked for the music to be turned off. Veltari explained the Coalition strategy, which involved using their faster ships to outmaneuver the Void Swarm while avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible, and she was surprised when the human officers asked detailed questions about swarm weapon capabilities. Kang listened to the briefing and realized that the Coalition had been fighting a defensive war from the beginning and had never considered taking the offensive against an enemy that could only be stopped by destroying their ability to reproduce. The human fleet had brought enough supplies for extended operations, including ammunition and fuel and repair facilities that could keep ships fighting for months without returning to base. And this level of preparation amazed the aliens. Rue presented her ground combat plans, and the Coalition officers were shocked to learn that humans were willing to board enemy vessels and fight in hand-to-hand combat, using weapons and tactics that most species considered too dangerous to attempt. The meeting continued as both sides tried to understand each other, and the humans learned that Coalition weapons were designed to disable rather than destroy, while human weapons were built to eliminate threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. Park demonstrated her fighter capabilities by flying through an asteroid field at speeds that made the alien observers close their eyes, and her casual attitude toward danger showed how different human pilots were from their Coalition counterparts. The tactical displays showed Void Swarm forces moving toward their position, and both fleets began preparing for combat, but the humans made preparations that confused their allies, including loading weapons that the Coalition had banned as too inhumane for warfare. Choi coordinated the human battle plan with Coalition forces, but she had backup plans that involved human ships fighting alone if their allies were destroyed or retreated, because human military doctrine never assumed that help would arrive when needed. The enemy ships appeared at the edge of sensor range, and their organic hulls pulsed with dark energy as they moved toward the combined fleet in formations that showed no concern for their own losses as long as they could close to combat range. Kang gave the order for all human ships to prepare for battle, and throughout the fleet weapon systems came online, while crews took their positions at battle stations they had trained at for years while hoping they would never need to use their skills in actual combat. The Coalition fleet moved into their traditional battle formations and began charging their weapons, while broadcasting surrender demands that the Void Swarm ignored because they had never shown any interest in negotiation or mercy. The human fleet moved into attack positions that put them between the Coalition ships and the approaching enemy, and their formation looked like a wall of black metal, ready to absorb whatever the Void Swarm could throw at them. The first battle between humans and the galaxy's greatest threat was about to begin, and neither the Coalition nor the Void Swarm understood what they were about to face when humanity showed the galaxy what Deathworlders could do when they decided to go to war. The Void Swarm ships closed distance with their organic hulls rippling as they prepared to engage the combined fleet, and their formation showed no regard for traditional battle tactics as they rushed forward like a swarm of angry insects seeking to overwhelm their prey through sheer numbers. Colonel Oh Sung-min watched from the bridge of his assault ship as the enemy vessels approached, and he checked his equipment one final time while his Marines prepared for boarding operations that the Coalition officers had declared impossible and suicidal. The Coalition fleet opened fire first with their elegant weapons that created beautiful streams of energy designed to disable enemy ships without causing unnecessary destruction, and their shots struck the Void Swarm vessels with precision that should have stopped the attack. But the organic ships absorbed the Coalition weapons fire, and their hulls began to regenerate almost immediately while they continued their advance and returned. Fire with weapons that tore through Coalition shields like they were made of paper fleet. Admiral Kang gave the order for human ships to engage, and the space around Kepler Station filled with projectiles and energy beams as humanity showed the galaxy what their weapons were designed to do to living targets. The human weapons were not elegant or beautiful, but they were effective, and their kinetic projectiles punched through Void Swarm hulls, while their energy weapons burned through organic armor that had seemed invincible moments before. Major Han So-ra led her assault teams toward the breach points that human weapons had torn in enemy hulls, and her soldiers moved through space in powered armor that let them survive in conditions that would kill unprotected beings. The Coalition officers watched in horror as human Marines deliberately flew toward damaged enemy ships and began cutting their way inside, using tools that seemed designed for demolition rather than precision. Boarding operations Captain Bae Won-sik carried explosives that made Coalition observers nervous because humans seemed willing to use weapons that could destroy their own ships if they miscalculated, but the human soldiers treated these dangerous tools like routine equipment. The first boarding action began when Oh's Marines cut through the hull of a Void Swarm vessel and found themselves fighting in corridors filled with organic growths that pulsed with alien life while creatures that defied description tried to stop their advance. Lieutenant Nam Ye-jin coordinated intelligence gathering from inside the enemy ship, and her reports described a vessel that was more like a living organism than a machine with systems that could adapt and change to counter human tactics. The human Marines fought their way through the ship using weapons and tactics that shocked their Coalition allies, because humans seemed to have no concept of proportional response when dealing with an enemy that threatened their survival. Oh planted explosive charges throughout the enemy vessel, while his team held defensive positions against Void Swarm defenders, and his casual attitude toward the danger made it clear that human soldiers had trained for missions that other species would never attempt. The Coalition fleet tried to coordinate with human forces, but their traditional battle formations were useless against an enemy that ignored conventional tactics, and their beautiful ships began taking damage that their repair systems could not handle. Human ships moved through the battle zone like predators hunting prey, and their formations shifted constantly as they adapted to enemy movements with flexibility that came from training. In chaotic environments where survival depended on quick thinking, the Void Swarm tried to surround isolated human vessels, but found that every ship was prepared for solo combat and carried enough firepower to fight multiple enemies while their heavy armor absorbed damage that would have destroyed Coalition ships' park. Jimin led her fighters through the enemy formation using maneuvers that terrified her Coalition escorts because she flew between enemy ships at distances that left no room for error while targeting vulnerable points with precision strikes. The human fighters moved like they were extensions of their pilots, and their weapons fired in patterns that showed years of practice in three-dimensional combat where every direction could contain threats that required immediate response. Bay's demolition charges detonated inside the enemy ship, and the explosion tore through organic corridors, while Oh's Marines fought their way toward the ship's core, where intelligence suggested the Void Swarm stored their reproductive systems. The Coalition commanders sent frantic messages asking human forces to withdraw from such dangerous operations, but the humans ignored these requests and continued their assault with determination that bordered on madness. Han's assault teams breached the enemy ship's central chamber and found a nightmare of organic machinery that pulsed with dark energy while creating new Void Swarm creatures that emerged from growth pods to attack the intruders. The human soldiers fought in close quarters using weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat, and their armor absorbed impacts that would have killed unprotected beings while they methodically destroyed everything that moved. Nam transmitted intelligence data back to the human fleet in her analysis of Void Swarm biology, revealed weaknesses that could be exploited by weapons the Coalition had never considered using against living opponents. The battle continued around them as human ships demonstrated combat doctrines that prioritized mission completion over crew survival, and their willingness to take casualties shocked allies who had never seen such dedication to victory. O reached the ship's core and planted his largest explosive charge while enemy creatures swarmed his position, and his team held them back long enough for him to complete the mission before fighting their way back toward their extraction point. The Void swarm ship began dying as human explosives destroyed its vital systems and the organic hull started collapsing, while O's Marines raced through corridors that were closing around them like a living trap. Coalition ships moved to provide covering fire for the human extraction, but their weapons were not designed for the kind of precision strikes needed to help Marines fighting inside an enemy vessel without hitting their own people. The human assault teams reached their extraction point just as Bay's charges detonated and destroyed the enemy ship's ability to regenerate while the structure began breaking apart around them. Park's fighters provided close support during the extraction, and her pilots flew through debris fields that would have grounded Coalition pilots while maintaining the kind of formation discipline that only came from training in impossible conditions. The boarding operation succeeded, and the Void swarm vessel died in space, while human Marines returned to their ships with intelligence that would change how the galaxy fought against an enemy that had seemed invincible. The Coalition fleet watched in amazement as human forces celebrated a victory that had cost them casualties, but had achieved an objective that alien commanders had declared impossible to accomplish. The battle ended with human ships maintaining their positions while Coalition forces tried to understand what they had witnessed and realized that their new allies fought wars using methods that defied everything they thought they knew about civilized combat. The joint campaign against the Void Swarm continued across multiple star systems, and Dr. Shin Haiwan established her field hospital in what Coalition forces considered an active combat zone, while she performed surgery on wounded soldiers under conditions that would have paralyzed alien medical personnel. Engineer Park Kyung-soo worked in the damaged sections of human ships that were still taking enemy fire, and his casual attitude toward radiation levels and environmental hazards that would kill most alien species showed why humans were called Deathworlders by the rest of the galaxy. Commander Lee Young-gi led reconnaissance missions into Void swarm-controlled space using ships that could operate in hostile environments where Coalition vessels needed full environmental protection, and her pilots gathered intelligence while flying through asteroid fields and radiation storms. Sergeant Lim Do-hyun commanded a Marine squad that fought in boarding actions against enemy ships, and his soldiers showed pain tolerance that amazed alien observers who could not understand how humans continued fighting after taking injuries that would incapacitate other species. The Coalition medical officers tried to help treat human casualties, but found that human physiology was so different from their own that standard alien medical procedures were useless and sometimes made injuries worse instead of better. Shin worked with alien doctors to develop new treatment protocols, and her research revealed that humans could survive damage to organs that were considered vital in other species, and their healing rates were far beyond what galactic medical science considered possible. The human ships continued to take punishment that would have destroyed Coalition vessels, and Park kept them fighting using repair techniques that involved working in sections of the ship that were open to vacuum while enemy weapons fire continued around him. Coalition engineers watched in fascination as human repair crews used welding equipment in zero-gravity environments while wearing simple protective gear, instead of the full environmental suits that alien workers required for similar operations. Lee's reconnaissance flights took her through regions of space that were considered uninhabitable, and her ships operated normally in radiation fields that would have killed Coalition crews within minutes of exposure. The intelligence she gathered showed that Void swarm forces were larger than anyone had estimated, and their reproductive capabilities meant that every day of delay allowed them to create more ships and soldiers for their endless war against galactic civilization. Lim's Marines fought in hand-to-hand combat using weapons that Coalition forces had banned as too dangerous for civilized warfare, and their training in close-quarters battle gave them advantages that alien soldiers could not match. The boarding operations continued as human forces developed new tactics for fighting inside enemy ships and their willingness to operate in damaged vessels that were venting atmosphere and leaking radiation, shocked their alien allies. Shin's medical research revealed that human soldiers could fight effectively, even after losing significant amounts of blood, and her field reports described cases where injured Marines continued combat operations that would have required immediate evacuation for alien casualties. The coalition commanders began to understand that human concepts of acceptable risk were completely different from their own, and what aliens considered emergency situations were routine operating conditions for Deathworlder forces. Park's engineering teams kept human ships operational, using spare parts and improvised repairs that violated coalition safety regulations, but worked effectively in combat conditions where perfect solutions were not available. The human supply chain was based on assumptions of total war and extended operations. Without resupply, and their logistics teams carried equipment for scenarios that coalition planners had never considered possible. Lee discovered void swarm staging areas in systems that coalition forces had declared too dangerous to approach, and her pilots mapped enemy positions while flying through environments that would have destroyed alien reconnaissance ships. The intelligence data showed that the enemy was preparing for a massive assault on coalition core worlds, and their forces were gathering in numbers that made previous attacks look like minor skirmishes. Lim's squad fought their way through a void swarm breeding facility, and his reports described organic machinery that created new enemy soldiers at rates that explained how the enemy could sustain such heavy casualties without weakening. The humans began developing weapons specifically designed to destroy void swarm reproductive capabilities, and their research involved studying alien biology in ways that made coalition scientists uncomfortable. Shin treated casualties from battles that lasted for days without pause, and her medical teams operated in field conditions that required them to make decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Triage protocols that human medics used were based on military necessity, rather than the preservation of life at any cost. And this practical approach to medicine horrified alien doctors who had never faced such choices. Park's engineering reports showed that human ships were designed to continue fighting even after taking catastrophic damage, and their redundant systems meant that vessels could operate with hull breaches and system failures that would cripple coalition ships. The human fleet began using tactics that involved deliberately sacrificing damaged vessels to protect functional ones, and their willingness to write off expensive ships for tactical advantage was incomprehensible to alien commanders. Lee's reconnaissance missions revealed that the Void Swarm was moving toward a final assault on the coalition capital system, and their forces included ship types that had never been seen before in previous battles. The intelligence suggested that the enemy had been holding back their most powerful units, and the upcoming battle would determine whether galactic civilization survived or fell to an enemy that knew only destruction. Lim's Marines prepared for what might be their final mission, and their training focused on operations that assumed they would not survive, but might accomplish objectives that could save their allies. The human forces made preparations that shocked their coalition partners because they included protocols for situations where retreat was impossible, and victory could only be achieved through total sacrifice. Shin established emergency medical facilities that could handle massive casualties, and her teams prepared for battle conditions that would test human endurance beyond anything they had faced before. The campaign had shown the galaxy what Deathworlders could accomplish when they decided to go to war, but the final battle would reveal whether human determination could overcome an enemy that seemed designed to destroy all life in the universe. The final battle began when Void Swarm forces emerged from hyperspace in massive numbers around the coalition capital system, and their dark ships filled space like a plague of insects ready to consume everything that stood between them and the heart of galactic civilization. Admiral Wan Jae-sung commanded the human reserve fleet that had been hidden in the outer system, and his ships moved into position using stealth technology that kept them invisible until the moment they were ready to strike at the enemy's most vulnerable targets. Captain Song Minji piloted humanity's most advanced fighter, and her squadron carried weapons that had never been used in combat because they were designed for enemies that could not be defeated. Through conventional means, General Ko Hyun-woo prepared his planetary assault forces for ground operations that would determine whether coalition worlds could be defended or whether entire planets would be sacrificed to stop an enemy that could not be reasoned with. Dr. An Soo-jin had studied void swarm biology, and her research revealed that their reproductive systems were vulnerable to weapons that attacked organic matter at the cellular level, but using such weapons would require getting close enough to enemy ships to deploy them. The coalition fleet took defensive positions around their capital world, but their formations were designed for battles between civilized opponents, and they were not prepared for an enemy that attacked. Like a natural disaster, Fleet Admiral Kang stood on his flagship bridge and watched enemy forces deploy in patterns that showed they intended to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers while accepting casualty rates that would break any normal military force. The human fleet revealed their hidden reserves as ship after ship appeared from concealment and took positions that put them between the coalition worlds and the approaching void swarm forces. One's reserve fleet included vessels that had been kept secret even from coalition allies, and their weapon systems were designed for scenarios that most species preferred not to think about because they involved the complete destruction of enemy forces. Song's fighter squadron carried nuclear warheads modified with Dr. An's research, and her pilots were prepared for missions that would require them to fly into the heart of enemy formations where survival was not expected. The Void Swarm forces began their assault, and their organic ships moved like living creatures as they swarmed toward the defensive lines, while ignoring losses that would have forced any other military force to retreat. Ko's ground forces prepared for planetary defense operations that would involve fighting in cities and civilian areas where the rules of engagement meant nothing to an enemy that saw all life as something to be consumed. The first phase of the battle saw coalition forces trying to maintain their traditional formations while human ships moved through the combat zone like predators hunting prey, and their tactics adapted constantly to enemy movements. Kang realized that conventional warfare would not stop an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, and he authorized the deployment of weapons that humanity had hoped they would never need to use. The Doomsday Protocol began with human ships launching planet-killer weapons at void swarm staging areas and their willingness to destroy entire systems. To prevent enemy advancement, shocked coalition forces who had never seen such devastating firepower, Song led her fighters through enemy formations while carrying warheads that could sterilize entire ships, and her squadron accepted mission parameters. That meant most of her pilots would not return from their attacks. The nuclear strikes began destroying Void Swarm reproductive facilities, but the enemy responded by sending suicide ships toward coalition worlds, and their organic hulls carried enough destructive power to eliminate entire planets. One's reserve ships moved to intercept the suicide vessels using ramming tactics that destroyed both human and enemy ships, but prevented the Void Swarm from reaching their targets. Ko's Marines fought in the ruins of coalition cities where Void Swarm forces had managed to land, and his soldiers held positions that could not be defended, while civilian populations evacuated to safer worlds. The battle continued as human forces demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice anything necessary to prevent enemy victory, and their casualty rates mounted while they achieved objectives that saved millions of alien lives. Dr. An's biological weapons proved effective against Void Swarm reproductive systems, but deploying them required human ships to approach enemy vessels at distances where survival was nearly impossible. The coalition forces watched as their human allies accepted losses that would have ended any other military campaign, but continued fighting with determination that bordered on madness. Song's fighter exploded inside a Void Swarm hive ship after she delivered her nuclear payload to the enemy's reproductive core, and her sacrifice eliminated a breeding facility that could have produced thousands of enemy soldiers. The planetary defense operation saw human Marines holding positions until the last possible moment before falling back to new defensive lines, and their tactics bought time for civilian evacuations. At the cost of entire units, Kang authorized the use of antimatter weapons against Void Swarm command ships, and these attacks created explosions that could be seen from neighboring star systems while they eliminated enemy coordination capabilities. The final phase of the battle began when Wan's fleet surrounded the remaining Void Swarm forces and began systematic destruction operations that left no enemy ships capable of escape or reproduction. Ko's ground forces fought their last battle in the ruins of the coalition capital city, where Void Swarm creatures had broken through all defensive lines and only human Marines stood between the enemy and complete victory. The battle ended when the last Void Swarm ship was destroyed, and the galaxy fell silent as both sides counted their losses and realized that the war had been won at a cost that would change galactic civilization forever. The Coalition survivors looked at their human allies and understood that they had been saved by a species that thought about warfare in ways that peaceful civilizations could never comprehend. Admiral Li Dongwu spoke to the Coalition Council after the victory, and his words became the foundation for humanity's role as the galaxy's protectors when he said that Deathworlders existed to do what others could not. The human fleet began establishing defense stations throughout Coalition space, and their ships took positions where they could watch for new threats while the galaxy rebuilt from the devastation of the Void Swarm War. The aliens realized that they had gained not just allies but guardians who would stand between civilization and the darkness that existed beyond the borders of known space, and who would pay any price necessary. To protect the innocent, humanity had answered the Coalition's call for help, and in doing so had revealed that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was the willingness to become the monster that other monsters feared.